Hello students, welcome to lesson 13 of the Changing Economic World topic. In this series of lessons, the next 6 or so, we will be discussing how we can reduce the development gap. So these lessons hopefully will be more positive for you and will help you to understand how we can make the world a better, more equal and fairer place. Take a moment to write the date, title and learning objective, and make sure you have a pen and paper ready to write notes. Get a highlighter as well so you can highlight key points as you go along. Okay. Time to check your understanding of prior learning. Please write 1 to 8, attempt the questions, pause the video and then mark your answers. Go for it. Okay, let's review the answers. The export of primary products and import of manufactured products leads to a trade deficit, where the value of a country's imports is more than its exports. 2. Colonialism is the process in which stronger countries take control of weaker ones by force. 3. War can prevent development by damaging vital infrastructure, for example roads, houses and schools. 4. What does DTM stand for? Demographic Transition Model. 5. In stage 3 of the DTM, women are increasingly well educated, have moved to cities and use contraception to prevent pregnancy. 6. The multi-measure of development that combines scores of literacy rate, life expectancy and GDP per capita is called the Human Development Index. 7. The happiness, health and comfort people feel in their life is called their quality of life. Not to be confused with their standard of living, which is about what they have. 8. The Philippines was badly affected by what tropical storm in 2013? That was Typhoon Haiyan. Please give yourselves a mark out of 8. Any that you got wrong, write down the question and the answer and test yourself on it. Come back to this quiz in a week and attempt it again. Okay, this lesson I'm going to introduce the first tool that we have to reduce the development gap, which is called aid. I'm going to show you some photos now to see if I can access your prior knowledge and help to find out how much you already know. From these photos I'm going to show you 3 questions. Please answer the questions from memory and then we will discuss the answers. Here are the pictures. Here are the questions. Pause the video, go for it. So for the first question, what is international aid? You may have thought of a number of things that you might have heard of in adverts or newspapers or on the news or on Twitter or elsewhere. But international aid is when one country or a group of people freely gives by choice money or resources or training or services to another country or another group of people to help them in some way. What type of country do you think mostly receives international aid? Well, you should have put less developed countries, LICs or even NEEs. Perhaps it's after a disaster or a lack of water. Perhaps it's for a road. Write as many forms of aid as you can see. Well, I'm just going to go through these and you tick off which ones you have. So the first type of aid is money aid. So here, simply giving what's called a cash transfer from one person to another to help them have more money. Other types of aid are resources aid, where you give them things that will help them, but it's not directly money. So for example, a pump to gather water from underground, or phones to be able to communicate better with people. So if you run a business, you can be more effective. Or it could be a tractor to help a farmer be more productive with their farm. It could be seeds, again, to help a farmer grow more crops. Or if you're giving short-term aid after an emergency, it could be food to help them survive. Finally, it could be developing infrastructure so that they can transport more easily. This could be in the form of roads or in the form of power stations like a hydroelectricity dam. And the final form of aid is services, so things like education or healthcare. Today I'm going to introduce you to all the forms of aid and how they work. But I'm not going to tell you about necessarily in detail what's good or bad about each of them. That I will do in part 2 of next lesson. Okay. There are 3 key words that you need to know this lesson and throughout it if you're going to understand exactly what I'm talking about. Here they are. The first one, international aid, you need to know what that is. You also need to know that an aid donor is the country or group of people that give the aid, and an aid recipient They're the people or the country that receives the aid. Please write these 3 keywords now and their definitions, and take your highlighter and highlight the keywords. Attempt these 5 questions to see if you can work out and identify which ones of these sentences are aid. So just write yes or no in response to each of these. Pause the video and check the answers. So number 1, a hotel worker in the USA sends money back to his family in Mexico. That is not aid. That's someone sending money back to his own family. That's called a remittance. It's when you send money back to your family in another country. A remittance. Number 2, a company in the USA pays a factory in China to manufacture shoes for it. That is not aid either, because that's not being done to help people. It's paying the factory to help increase its profits. 3, the UK sends the military to Nepal to help rescue people after an earthquake. That is aid. 4, China sends money to Ethiopia in 2014. It expects the money back after 2 years. That is not aid, that's called a loan, when you expect the money back. And number 5, the charity WaterAid builds a water pump in a village in Tanzania, which is a country in Africa, to supply clean water to people. It trains people to use and repair it. That it is aid. It's providing a resource and a service, training, directly to help people. It doesn't expect anything in return. Okay. If you didn't understand this, go back to your definition of aid, and I'm going to continue to develop your understanding now. So the big question today is, what is international aid, and what are the different types? Now, you may have seen in a newspaper or on a YouTube ad a story by an advert of a child who looks like they're hungry, or they're crying, or they're somehow suffering. That is the typical picture of aid that is presented to people around the world. And usually at the end of that ad it will show you the name of the charity, for example Save the Children or Oxfam or WaterAid. But in reality this is only one type of international aid. It's the most commonly known one because they are the best fundraisers. They're the ones who are most advertising aid, the charities. There are, broadly speaking, 6 types of aid that I want you to know about, and that are really important to know about, and will help you understand how the developed countries of the world, the HICs, assist the less developed countries of the world, the LICs, to help them develop. So, I'm going to show you the 6 types of aid as flow diagrams, which means I'll write a sentence and then put an arrow to another sentence to show you how these 6 types of aid work. Please copy what I have. I would suggest that you try to fit at least 3 of them onto a page. Okay, so the first type of aid, let's look at it, is like this. This is a photo of a lady in a country called Sudan who's receiving food from the United States government to help the people after a famine. A famine means when there's no food for people. This type of aid is not supposed to last a long time. It's just supposed to help people deal with the lack of food until they can grow more of their own. This is called short-term aid. Meanwhile, this lady and her colleague are checking on a pump that the European Union has funded to be built in a country in Africa called Ethiopia. This provides clean water to people. This is a type of long-term aid. It's supposed to last a long time, and it's not supposed to help only after an emergency. Aid can also be given like this. This doctor is providing healthcare and medical checks to people in rural Kenya. This is a type of service being provided. And it's also a form of short-term aid because it's not supposed to last a long time. It's just supposed to check for people's health and perhaps provide them with medication. This man here works at a charity, and he is helping to educate people in South Africa. Help educate children in South Africa. This is a form of long-term aid because education provides a lasting benefit that they take forward with them through their lives. Here, another picture of a worker, an aid worker from the European Union, similar to this lady here. This man is training this farmer in how to make a better use of his crops and also what trees to plant to improve the quality of the soil. This is another form of aid that we're going to look at today. Aid is not just services or resources, however. It could be a direct transfer of money. Many people in African countries receive aid in the form of money through their mobile phones, through bank accounts on their mobile phones. This is called a cash transfer. And these people can use these small amounts of money to be able to buy additional crops or to start a business. Finally, aid may be in this form here. These are the largest aid projects and they're the most expensive. This is infrastructure aid, and it's often called multilateral aid. I'm going to explain that further in a second. Building infrastructure like a road or a power station or a bridge is the most expensive and most difficult, but can help the most people if done right. So, that was the introduction. Now let's draw these up so that you understand them clearly and how they work. The first type of aid is called short-term aid. Write it like I do. Here's how it works. Short-term aid is usually given by a government or an NGO, which is a charity, it's a non-governmental organization. So it's an organization that doesn't work for the government and doesn't work for profit, in an HIC or an NE. And here's what they do. Suppose there's an earthquake or a disaster in a country. The government or the NGO will give emergency supplies like food, water, medicine or shelter to an LIC or an NE government or to the people directly in the LICs. And the aim of short-term aid is to solve an immediate problem like hunger or injury. So if you think about our case study of the Nepal earthquake in 2015, you'll remember that the charity, the NGO Red Cross, came and provided healthcare and shelters to the people. It didn't stay for a long time, only a matter of months, in order to help the people survive after the disaster. Similarly, after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013, the United States government sent a ship called the USS George Washington, which provided helicopters that were able to reach people on the islands of the Philippines that were cut off by flooding. These are short-term aid examples. By contrast, you have long-term aid. Now, long-term aid is a very different type of aid with a very different purpose. In this situation, a government or NGO or an international organization, for example, the World Bank, an international organization is one that is run by many different countries. So similar to short-term aid so far, in long-term aid, the purpose is to give training or construction projects, for example, roads or dams or schools or houses or hospitals, directly to the people or areas in the LICs that need it. For example, a rural village. And the aim is to help people in the LICs to develop long-term. Better jobs, for example, better health. So long-term aid, the goal is to make sure that the people in the LICs no longer need aid in the future. Whereas short-term aid is to help people after a disaster. Think about an analogy like this. If you fall over and hurt yourself, and you cut yourself, then you could put a plaster on it and put antiseptic on it. That treats the injury. But long-term aid, that would be an example of short-term aid. But long-term aid would be perhaps teaching people where to run around and play if they're a child, where it's safe to do so, why they might not want to run, for example, in a road or on tarmac, how they might want to run on grass or soft ground instead. It reduces the need for you to help them in the future, and it provides them with the understanding of how to keep safe. That is an example of long-term aid. Within those two types, short-term and long-term aid, there are more detailed types, based on where the aid comes from and who it goes to. The first type of aid is the most complicated one we're going to look at. It's called multilateral aid. This is aid from multiple governments to the government of one country. And here's how it works. For example, take three typical HICs, the USA, the UK and Germany. They could all give money to the World Bank, which is an international organization. The World Bank is an organization of experts trying to end world poverty. So its main purpose, its main goal is to end poverty and improve development around the world. And it has some of the brightest minds and best trained people on that job. And these governments of the HICs give money to this organization so that it can use that money to fund projects in LICs, for example, wind farms in Ethiopia or Mali. Multilateral aid is important because it involves the most money and can build the biggest projects. So in theory, it can help the most people. Also, the governments of the HICs give money to the World Bank because they believe that this organization knows best how to end poverty, because it's based on experts in poverty. They're specialized at it. For example, if you're ill, you go to a doctor because you know they're experts at it. The World Bank, similarly, is based on experts of international development. That's multilateral aid, from many governments to an international organization like the World Bank, then to the LICs. By contrast, you have bilateral aid. Bilateral aid is aid sent directly between two governments. There's no middle step here. And it's only one government to another government. So it works like this. HIC government like the UK sends money directly to an LIC government. For example, the government of Chad in a country in the Sahara Desert in Africa. And that government then decides what to do with the money it's been given by the HIC government. For example, it could spend it on healthcare or education. So bilateral aid is one government to another government. Then we have something called tied aid. This is the most controversial type of aid, which means it's the type of aid that people most disagree on whether it's a good thing. Here's how it works. The HIC or the NEE government, they give aid to the LIC government similar to bilateral aid, but here's the difference. They expect something in return. They make conditions for giving the aid in the first place. One analogy or way of thinking about how this would work is this. Suppose a student who doesn't behave particularly well or doesn't work particularly hard goes to a teacher after school and asks them to help them revise just before an exam, which they don't feel ready for. Now, this would take the teacher's time and it would take effort on their part. So the teacher says, yes, I will help you, but in return, I expect you every day, at the end of the day, to show me a report, a behavior report, saying that you've been working hard in every lesson. Only then will I continue to help you with your studies. That would be an example of tied aid. So it's giving help, but with a condition attached. Now, here's why tied aid is so controversial. Because in the past, governments of HICs have often used tied aid to get what they want out of the LIC. For example, suppose an LIC government needs aid from an HIC government to deal with a drought, which has killed lots of the crops in that country. And as a result, has put the country in debt and has meant that it is in a desperate state. The HIC government offers to help, but in return it says, LIC, we've noticed that you have lots of natural resources underground, for example, oil. Our TNCs, our big companies like British Petroleum, BP or Shell, want to drill for oil in your country so that they can sell it and make money. Here's what we'd like you to do in return. We'd like you to reduce the taxes that our TNCs have to pay to you if they come and work in your country. That way, they will make more of a profit and we will help you. That is an example of tied aid. Then we have voluntary aid, the most famous form of aid because it involves the charities and the famous adverts and campaigns that we see on TV, for example, comic relief or sports relief. Here's how it works. This is no longer about governments. The people in HICs, everyday people like you and I, give money to an NGO, a charity, like Oxfam or Red Cross or Save the Children. And then we trust that that charity will give whatever it can to the LIC in the form of emergency supplies or healthcare or education or whatever it's promised to give. And then the NGO in voluntary aid will almost always give it directly to the people in LICs, and it will not go through a government. So voluntary aid Big difference between voluntary aid and other types of aid is that it doesn't involve governments. It goes directly from people in HICs to a charity and then straight to the people who need it. Voluntary aid usually involves much less money than bilateral or multilateral aid. It's much smaller, but it goes directly to the people who need it. That's a difference. Okay, let's check your understanding so far. Please write 1 to 14 in your books, read the paragraphs, use the key words to fill in the gap. Since this is an online lesson and you're not actually being taught by me in the classroom, I would strongly recommend that you write the whole paragraphs and that you fill in the gaps so that you have a full answer with which to revise from, and then highlight the words that you put in the gaps. So, write out the paragraph, pause the video, and then check your answers. Okay. Foreign aid is the donation of money, resources, or services. If the aid is given to help people survive after an emergency, like a natural disaster, then it is short-term aid. By contrast, aid given to help a country develop by improving education or infrastructure is called long-term aid. If a country, for example, China, gives aid in the form of building schools or hospitals in an LIC, but expects something in return, like the right to exploit natural resources, this is called tied aid. If the government of China gives aid to the government of an LIC, for example Ethiopia and Africa, this would be bilateral aid, as it goes directly between governments. Aid can also be given by people in an HIC to an NGO like WaterAid, which then works in an NEE or LIC to solve a problem or help the country develop. When people give to NGOs, this is called voluntary aid, number 9. Governments in HICs also donate to a specialist organisation, which has experts working out how to help countries develop. The biggest example is the World Bank. This organisation uses money to build infrastructure projects in NEEs and LICs, like renewable energy and electricity lines. This type of aid is called multilateral aid because it involves an organisation funded and run by multiple countries. A big difference between voluntary and bilateral aid is that voluntary aid goes through NGOs, whereas bilateral aid goes through governments. An NGO is an organisation that is not part of the government, is trying to solve a problem, for example low development, and is not trying to make a profit. Give yourselves a mark out of 14, and if you didn't perform well, watch the explanation again and attempt this in a few days' time. As ever, it's time to really test your memory and your understanding, more importantly, and this will help you remember these ideas for the future. Please answer these 4 questions in your book, pause the video, and then check your answers using the provided answers that I've given you. Go. So number 1, outline 2 key features of voluntary aid. You could have said any of these following 2. It's from people in HICs to NGOs. It's often small-scale projects, like for a village. It's often directly to people in LICs, bypasses the government. And often governments are not involved at all, on either side. 2. If a HIC helps a LIC by funding Build Back Better after a natural disaster, what type of aid is this? Short-term or long-term? Explain your point. It's called long-term aid. And Build Back Better is a response to disasters that reduces future hazard risk. Build Back Better means, if you don't know, if you haven't studied it, it means building construction stronger so that future natural hazards like earthquakes or hurricanes don't cause as much damage. So aid for Build Back Better is long-term as it helps a country develop but does not save people immediately. 3. Suggest a reason why countries donate to an international organisation like the World Bank rather than only giving aid directly to LICs. One reason could be governments and HICs believe that experts at the World Bank know how to use aid best. Or you could have said multilateral aid from many countries can often fund larger projects than bilateral aid, which may help more people. And number 4, outline 2 key differences between voluntary aid and bilateral aid. Any of these 2. Voluntary aid is from NGOs, bilateral aid is between governments. Voluntary usually involves small amounts of money, and voluntary aid goes directly to the people in LICs, whereas bilateral aid goes to the government. Okay? From memory, write 2 questions from anything you've learned this lesson. Answer them, and then test yourselves in a week. Thank you so much for joining me for this part 1 lesson of aid. Next lesson we will be exploring the merits and problems with certain types of aid. Okay. Thank you very much. Well done.